As editor of the Arthur Miller Journal, I'd like to welcome you to this special event where we once again gather to witness the significant legacy that Arthur Miller gave to American drama and American society. I would like to thank some people before we begin without whom this event would not be possible. Of course, President Dugan and Dean Houlihan and Dr. Lynn Jackson for their continued support of the humanities, Dr. Tim Dugan and the members of the Communications Department for organizing and directing and participating in the stage reading, Lauren, who produced the handsome program, Rob Olive, the Director of Special Events, and my fellow editors of the journal, Dr. E. Maloney and Dr. Scott Weiss. We've called this a spring colloquy, but what we're really doing today, I think, is celebrating. After all, spring is a time for celebrating after the long and cold and snowy winter that we've had in New York. So today we're celebrating the publication of the spring issue of the Arthur Miller Journal, the joy of the theater arts and performance, and the anniversary of Miller's version of Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People. In case you don't know, Miller's version of The Enemy of the People remains a little-known play compared to All My Sons and Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, and A View from the Bridge. But in it, Miller confronted political, moral, and social issues that continue to haunt us 60 years after he wrote it. And so to help us understand the play in that context, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. We're fortunate this evening to have with us one of the more influential and distinguished scholars of world drama. Enoch Brater is the Kenneth T. Rowe Collegiate Professor of Dramatic Literature at the University of Michigan. In the spring of 2007, he gave his inaugural lecture entitled Drama Matters, Suitcases, Sand, and Dry Goods, when assuming the Rowe Chair as the keynote address marking the opening of the Arthur Miller Theater at the University of Michigan. His most recent publications include Arthur Miller's Global Theater, Arthur Miller, A Playwright's Life and Works, Arthur Miller's America, Theater and Culture in a Time of Change. His other work includes Feminine Focus, The New Women Playwrights, and Around the Absurd, Essays on Modern and Postmodern Drama. In addition, no American scholar has been as influential as Dr. Brater in promoting and examining the work of Samuel Beckett. His books on Beckett include The Drama in the Text, Beckett's Late Fiction, The Essential Samuel Beckett, an illustrated biography, Beckett at 80, Beckett in Context, and Beyond Minimalism, Beckett's Late Style in the Theater. Dr. Brater is also the general editor of the new series of definitive scholarly and student editions of Arthur Miller's plays, which have just been published in cooperation with Miller's Estate and Methuen Drama. And finally, he is currently working on editing the letters and journals of Arthur Miller for future publication. So I present to you Dr. Enoch Brater.
So thank you, Steve. As you can see, I'm a general workaholic. Not slowing down, I'm happy to say. I'm also very pleased to be back here at St. Francis, and I want to thank the administrators here who've made this possible, and for their continuing support for Arthur Miller's studies and for the work that Steve and his colleagues are doing, which in a big way puts St. Francis in a very positive position in terms of the humanities all over the world. What I would like to do in about a half an hour is talk about the play that we're going to have a reading from, An Enemy of the People, and to situate it in Arthur Miller's career, which is, I think, probably pretty much familiar to us in great iconic works like Death of a Salesman and All My Sons, The Crucible, A View from the Bridge. And it's particularly interesting to talk about that right here because, as many of you know, Arthur Miller was a long-term resident of Brooklyn Heights, mostly at 31 Grace Court, which is just a short distance away. An Enemy of the People, in Arthur Miller's version, reveals a great deal about his commitment to American society and also to his commitment to making American drama part of the national conversation that any healthy democracy needs to have about itself. The it is not surprising that he turned to Ibsen. And I think we want to talk about that initially. It was really at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor that Arthur Miller first encountered the Ibsen works. His professor was Kenneth Rowe, and Kenneth Rowe was responsible for introducing what he called this Scandinavian playwright to several generations of undergraduates at my university. He famously said to his students, "You may not have heard of this Scandinavian, but by the time you leave my class, you'll know all about him." And Miller took to the Ibsen plays like fish to water. What is interesting about these plays that Miller was attracted to were, in fact, the plays that most of us are familiar with if we know anything about the Ibsen repertory. These are the plays from Ibsen's middle period, great works like A Doll's House, Ghosts, The Wild Duck, and of course, especially things like Hedda Gabler, Rosmer's Home, et cetera, et cetera. It's a huge, huge repertory. And Ibsen was one of these very fortunate writers who lived for a very long time, so there are various periods of his work. But what we need to know about Miller's attraction to Ibsen was that he became interested in the Ibsen that we know today, the Ibsen of the middle period. Before that, Ibsen had been writing plays on very heroic subjects, mostly written in verse, that were set in other moments in history that dealt with questions of honor and duty, et cetera, et cetera. And late in his career, in the middle of his career, after having spent many years studying the new drama in Germany, he was able to transform his style to write in not only the language of everyday men and women, but to write about middle-class problems. And this, of course, led to the writing of plays like A Doll's House and Ghosts in particular. And An Enemy of the People is very much related to those plays. When A Doll's House was originally appeared, probably the most famous 19th century play in European drama, Ibsen was championed as the revealer of middle-class marriage and of the so-called new woman associated with the Nora cult. Ibsen himself was not happy with that designation because he thought he was writing not so much about the liberation of women, but about the liberation of any individual soul. But needless to say, the whole cult of Nora began to take all of Europe by storm. The play was quickly translated into other languages and became a huge kind of vehicle for great players all over theater centers in Paris, London, and certainly in Berlin. Ibsen was very much inspired by the reaction to the play because progressives all over Europe championed what he was doing in this play, and that became a source of great pride for him. And he then used that to investigate another issue, another very controversial issue in the play called Ghosts, which deals, among many other things, with the question of inherited sexual diseases. And of course, this was really something that Ibsen thought would follow very heavily upon the success of A Doll's House, but much to his dismay, the very same people who had championed his work in A Doll's House turned against him, including the so-called progressive press. And as a result of that, Ibsen wrote with vitriol this next play, which is the one we're going to talk about right now, called An Enemy of the People. I think it's important to situate An Enemy of the People in relationship to works like A Doll's House and Ghosts, because it explains a lot about what he does in this particular play. And of course, Miller, as a student, as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, under the tutelage of Kenneth Rowe, became very quickly acquainted with these kind of issues. And An Enemy of the People, in particular, was an inspiration to him because it dealt with the whole question of the individual in relationship to society. And that becomes a theme that's very palpable to him. It's very interesting in the work that I'm doing right now on the letters and the diaries of Arthur Miller, how often he mentions the Ibsen plays, comparing certain situations that he's dealing with in his own lifetime to certain things that are very familiar to us from the Ibsen repertory. But that's to appear in the future. Another thing coincided with this interest in Ibsen, which was very, very important to Miller. Most of us associate Miller's reaction to the McCarthy period in our country with a work, his great work of the Crucible, which is, of course, the most revealing work, in my view, of anything that has ever been written in an imaginative way about this dark period in American history. Which is, of course, not an isolated example, but one that looms its ugly head from time to time, in which we see happening right all around us, even as I speak. But that was not his first reaction dramatically to the McCarthy period. The initial reaction to it was his revision, his adaptation of An Enemy of the People. He wrote it quickly and very practically because he wanted to help two very good friends of his, Frederick March and Florence, his wife, Florence Eldridge, who were friends of his and who were, of course, being brought before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and he wanted to write a vehicle for them that would display their talents. And of course, although the play is said to be an adaptation of the Ibsen work, it is, in fact, was fairly clear what Ibsen was writing about. The play was produced in New York in 1950. That is the Miller adaptation of An Enemy of the People. He said, I have made no secret of my early love for Ibsen's work. And he continues saying that he had been very much inspired by doing this because of contemporary activities. In 1990, he told Jack O'Brien, who directed the show for the American Playhouse on PBS, that he found Ibsen's 1882 hero, Dr. Stockman, quote, a kind of holy fool. Yet Ibsen's theme, Miller reflected, really, quote, concerns the crushing of the dissenting spirit by the majority, and the right and obligation of such a spirit to exist at all. The play, of course, as some of us know, tells the story of an idealistic doctor who discovers that the spring waters from which the spa draws its wealth are dangerously contaminated. As Stockman's fellow citizens realize the financial implications of his research, he comes under increasing pressure to keep silent. Miller was particularly struck by one of Dr. Stockman's lines in the original Ibsen play, which he changes to this, quote, the majority is never right until it does right. He later admitted that, quote, this particular subject can get me very, very angry. And it certainly did so at the time when he was transforming Ibsen's 5-act play into the 3-act structure that we know from the Miller version. He said, those who warp the truth, he wrote in the preface, very famous preface to this adaptation, quote, must inevitably be warped and corrupted themselves. And he shifts the locale from Ibsen's Norway to Clearwater Springs in Riverton, Maine in 1893. And as he did so, he not only Americanized the language of the play, but also its political metaphor. He said at the time, I am sure that few in the first New York audiences in the early 50s were terribly convinced by the play's warnings of danger to the environment. The anti-communist gale was blowing hard, and it was that metaphor that stood in the foreground, not the poisoning of the public water supply by mendacious and greedy interests. And I think it's interesting to hear Miller on that point, because this play, which is very popular in student productions all over the country, generally has had a whole new life because of our concern about what we're doing to this planet. But in fact, that was not the metaphor that was very much in the air of the 1950s. So the play was in fact seen as a huge political statement at the time. This is, of course, long before Miller is summoned before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The play that follows The Enemy of the People is, of course, the work that I referred to a moment ago called The Crucible. And in writing that play, Miller goes back in history, of course, as we all know, to the Salem witch trials to talk about the witch trials that are currently taking place in America. It's also important to keep in mind that it was that Miller was not called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities until well after the production of The Crucible on Broadway. What's fascinating about that is that when we look at some of the speeches from the play, particularly the speeches that he gives to Proctor in the drama, it stands almost as a reference to the speeches that he made himself before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Those are, of course, accessible online. You can actually look those up and compare them with the script of the Crucible. And, of course, that led to a very important moment, which I would consider of cognitive dissonance, because at the very time that Miller was brought before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, he was, of course, heavily involved with Marilyn Monroe. They were both waiting their divorces from their spouses at the time. Hers was then Joe DiMaggio. Marilyn, of course, bought everyone in Congress a year subscription to I.F. Stone's Weekly. And God knows what they made of that. But if you think of this tremendous situation, you look at the photographs of the time of Miller and Monroe together, it's hard to know what America would have made of this kind of duet. To go back to the play then, of course, although possibly not well known in the repertory of Miller plays, I think is a very interesting example of Miller trying to find a political metaphor for his drama. Miller was always worried about that because he didn't want to write something that was too much of the present. And that's an interesting thing you should think about, because in a play like All My Sons, which of course deals with war profiteering, was a strange play. Miller was very much aware of that when he wrote the play. America was feeling pretty good about itself, having defeated the Nazis in Europe and having defeated the Japanese in Asia. And at this moment, he writes this very nasty play about the war profiteering. And as Miller said, that was the play that began all the trouble that I eventually ran into. Even Death of a Salesman, you think of this great, great iconic work, probably one of the 2 or 3 most important plays written in the English language in the 20th century. Even that play goes against the grain, because while America is sort of celebrating itself and building highways and houses and transforming places like Long Island and all over the country, he writes a play about the underside of the American dream. And the references were, of course, quite extraordinary in the fact that he was saying, well, let's wait a minute and take a close look at things. To leap forward to The Crucible, which is the third of these very big plays, Miller wanted to find a metaphor. He wanted a controlling metaphor. He had a lot to say about the present, but he could only find a way to say it by going into the past. And he found it, of course, by examining the Salem witch trials. The Enemy of the People is very important here, because before he writes The Crucible and after he writes All My Sons and Death of a Salesman, by going back to Ibsen, by revising Ibsen, by finding the dynamics of the Ibsen play and updating it to the American world, he finds a very convenient way to control what he's trying to say. And I think that's an important thing we should think about Miller. Miller is not a polemicist. Miller is a dramatist. And one of the things that he learned from Professor Kenneth Rowe, and that figured out for himself, is that one of the reasons that Enemy of the People works so well is because the conflict, the dramatic conflict, of course, is represented by 2 characters, by Dr. Stockman and by his brother Peter. And of course, it's, as we learn in drama, in playwriting 101, it's very nice that they're also brothers at the time, because that brings up the whole Cain and Abel possibility. Always good to have a conflict embodied in a family. Miller was always attracted to that because, as he said, great drama in the West has always been about family. Oedipus Rex and King Lear, I rest my case. They are, of course, other things as well, but it tightens the knot of the situation. And one of the things that makes the Ibsen play work very well is that Miller can surrender himself and create a viable character in Peter Stockman. That Peter's side needs to be heard. It needs to be listened to. And that establishes the great conflict in the play. It's fairly clear that Ibsen is on the side of Dr. Stockman, but it's interesting what Miller says about him, that in fact Dr. Stockman is a kind of a holy fool. He's right, he has the truth, but he doesn't know how to convey the truth. He's also too much full of pride. And so you have an interesting sort of political energy in the play, a kind of political insight that keeps an enemy of the people going from a mere polemic against the forces against Dr. Stockman and really makes the drama work. Miller lifts that into his play. And he does something else as well, because the quote that I gave you from the Miller play, that the majority isn't right until it does right, that's really Miller and not Ibsen. In the Ibsen play, if you know it very well, the Ibsen play, Dr. Stockman is sort of so full of pride. And then he actually gets to the point where he condemns the majority. And there's a very famous line when he learns about you shouldn't wear your best pair of pants to go out and fight for truth and freedom, which is, of course, a very important line. Stanislavski refers to that in his biography, his autobiography, My Life in Art. Huge. You know, the Russians don't do anything in a short way. It's like Crime and Punishment, War and Peace. And one of the things that Stanislavski remembers as a young actor was playing the part of Dr. Stockman in the Ibsen play in a Russian translation just after the October Revolution, when there were, of course, riots in the major squares in Moscow. And when Dr. Stockman utters his line that you shouldn't go out and fight for truth and freedom in your best pair of pants, the audience just erupted in applause, and people came on stage and shook Stanislavski's hand. And then Stanislavski says in a very, very flamboyant passion, "It was then that I knew the power of theater." Okay. Now, in a sense, Miller refers to that as well, although he transforms that, because Miller was, of course, coming to the story with the whole inheritance of the first part of the 20th century, and was somewhat suspicious about what majorities could do. Majorities, in fact, had supported Hitler in Germany and in many other places in Europe, and majorities had done very strange things in our country as well. And so he began to be a little nervous about the kind of statement that he found in An Enemy of the People, and transforms it with a kind of historical awareness of his own culture, a democratic culture, which has the potential to do good and the potential to do not so good. And so, of course, in transforming that story, by placing it in Ibsen and updating it slightly, he was able to sort of find a way to make the play work. I think it's important for us to focus on that, because Miller has generally played the role during certainly his mature years as probably the closest thing we've had in our country to a public intellectual. We sometimes forget the craftsmanship that's involved in his work. And so when you look at An Enemy of the People, and we're going to have a sample of that fairly soon from our colleagues here at St. Francis, I think we need to appreciate not only the historical background of the play, Miller's attraction to Ibsen and to the whole question of social realism, and the whole question of trying to make drama, as I said earlier, a part of the national conversation that an informed democracy needs to have about itself. But we also need to appreciate the sheer energy and imagination of Miller in transforming a play and making it very much his own. We have today, therefore, a choice in producing this play. We could decide, for example, that we want to be true to Ibsen and its original context, or we could decide that we want to take this variation on Ibsen and make it work on the stage in a slightly different way. And I think the choice is up to theater practitioners and then for audiences to decide which of those really speaks most convincingly to the present. My own sense is that they both do. Ibsen's plays is a remarkable vehicle, and it's no surprise that Miller was attracted to it. I always tell my students at Michigan, when they're trying to find a play, when in doubt, do An Enemy of the People. Because even if you don't have the strongest actors in the world, the thesis of the play is so very compelling and so very accessible that it will carry you along the way. I think Miller was also attracted to this play for that very, very reason, because Miller committed the sin of being accessible. It's one of the reasons why so many high-tone critics in our own country have tended to dismiss Miller from time to time. Because, as I always tell people, you don't need Enoch Brater to tell you about what's going on in an Arthur Miller play. Everybody gets it. As Miller said, I wrote not from the skyscraper, but from the sidewalk. I wanted to write a drama so you could tell a man sitting next to you in the subway the story, and he would get it. And I think that's a remarkable thing. I mean, drama is a public forum. It always was a public forum, and all the attempts to make it something else, which of course it can be as well, is not where Miller went. He went to Ibsen. He did not go to O'Neill, he said. I could have gone to O'Neill, but I didn't. I went to Ibsen, and I think in finding Ibsen, he was able to articulate his own voice and his own very special place in the American theater.